My name is Sarah Harkins. Today, I will be presenting achievement data from Sandy Springs Middle School. I will be focusing on 8th grade math, but we will start with a holistic view of the school to paint the full picture. This information was presented to Sandy Springs Middle School's administration, the principal, assistant principals, administrative assistants, and math coach on November 18, 2021. The purpose of this presentation is to visually show student and teacher demographic data, followed by data examining the achievement gaps that persist among our students, particularly our students with disabilities, Hispanic students, and African American students. Please note, as we work through this presentation, notice the student performance of students with disabilities compared to students without disabilities. Further, notice the student performance of Hispanic and African American students when compared to white students. The mission of the school is to build a community of lifelong learners, problem solvers, and leaders. #OneCommunity. Here is some information about Sandy Springs Middle School at a glance. This was pulled from Fulton County's website. You can see that our 6th grade student number is much larger than our 7th and 8th grade student number. In general, we have around 900 students in the school. It is a medium stable school at around 82% with 24% mobility. You can get a glance of our program enrollment and racial composition, which we will talk about in more detail in the upcoming slides. You can see it in this graph how our student population has increased. It's still variable from year to year. 6th grade tends to be the largest grade out of all of them. But in general, our student population has remained fairly stable, slightly increasing from year to year. Here you can see the percentage of students receiving special services, including remedial, gifted, special education, and ESOL. The percentage of students receiving gifted services has decreased over time, while the percentage of remedial students has increased. Special education and English language learners have remained constant over time. When we break down our student population by race, we can see trends. We see that nearly half of our students are African American, followed by Hispanic students at about 1/3 of our total population. Our Hispanic and Asian student numbers have remained fairly constant, while our white and African American students have inversely changed over time. Our African American student population has increased, while our white student population has decreased. This was one of the more interesting notes from this presentation. The vast majority of teachers at Sandy Springs Middle School have between 1 and 10 years of experience, and that has remained constant over time. That trend is replicable throughout Fulton County, where most teachers have fewer than 10 years of experience. You see that we have between 5 and 7 new teachers on average every year, brand new to teaching, but we really don't have many teachers with more than 11 years of experience. More than half of our teachers are between 1 and 10. Most of our teachers here are female. That number has remained fairly stable over time. You can see we oscillate between 68 and 71 teachers, typically throughout a year. We have a fairly diverse staff that has remained constant over time, even with a staff turnover rate as high as what we have. Typically, between 30 and 40% of the staff turns over annually. Now that we have identified demographics within the building, let's look at some achievement data. It appears that more male students than female students are labeled as beginning learners, while more females than males are labeled as developing learners. In general, female students outperform male students. This is all subjects from 2018 to 2019 broken down by gender, just for a very holistic view of all of this. We will be digging more into the math data in just a second. I dug into the 8th grade math achievement data and I pulled reports by step group. Our African American students and our Hispanic students had a much higher incidence rate of beginning learners when compared to white, Asian, or multiracial students. Our white and Asian students had the highest prevalence of proficient learners, which is the targeted range for all students. This trend continues over time, which is beginning to show a major achievement gap. This focuses on Hispanic, African American, and white student test scores over time. Hispanic students have decreased their number of beginning and developing learners over the last 3 years, but not enough to close the gap. The number of proficient and distinguished learners are starting to climb, albeit very slowly. A similar trend can be seen with our African American students, where the number of beginning and developing learners has slowly increased over time. The percentage of students receiving a score of proficient has increased ever so slightly, while distinguished learners has remained constant at fewer than 5%. The lowest group of white students, beginning learners, matches the percentage of distinguished learners for Hispanic and African American students. Further, nearly 2/3 of our white students are scoring at the distinguished and proficient level. Again, this data shows a tremendous achievement gap. We want our students to be achieving proficient learner status, if not distinguished. Developing means they pass milestones, beginning means summer school. This slide gives an overview of milestone scores broken down by ethnicity. You can see that the number of beginning and developing learners is the highest in African American and Hispanic students, whereas the majority of white students are scoring at distinguished and proficient, which are levels 4 and 3. I intentionally graphed this way, comparing our students with and without disabilities to show the drastic range of scores. Our students with disabilities are consistently scoring at a level 1 and 2 at a much higher rate than their counterparts without disabilities. This slide shows students with disabilities compared to students without disabilities. This also shows that the number of beginning learners for students with disabilities has remained constant, while the number of proficient and distinguished has decreased over time. That does not follow the same trend as students without disabilities. As you can see, the green and the blue are starting to increase the proficient and distinguished for students without disabilities, while it's decreasing for students with disabilities. After looking at all of this data, we can make some pretty drastic statements. There are tons of strengths in this building. This is a very diverse school with a wide variety of extracurricular activities, including sports, academic clubs, and interest-based clubs. Overall, we have decreased the number of students performing at the beginning learner level across the board over the time period in question. That being said, we have two main areas for growth. The first is the achievement gap between students with and without disabilities. The second area for growth is the achievement gap between white students and Hispanic and African American students. Now I would like to give everyone a second to think about some of these questions. I want to know, what questions do you have? What do you notice about the data? What do you wonder about the data? What wishes do you have after viewing this data? Next steps. Here are some questions that we need to discuss, consider, and answer as a team. 1. How can we ensure that all students have an equal opportunity for success? 2. What teaching strategies can we implement for all teachers to encourage student growth among all populations? 3. What support is in place for both our students with disabilities and our teachers of students with disabilities? Number 4, what opportunities do students have to achieve success both in and out of the classroom? I think these are some very interesting questions that we need to be able to answer in order to do what's best for all of our students. Thank you for attending.